Afternoon from Tokyo, and good morning or good evening to those joining us from other time zones. It is my pleasure to chair paper session 2 of the ADBI Annual Conference 2025. This session features 2 timely and highly relevant papers that speak to the emerging policy challenges in Asia, followed by discussion comments and an open Q&A. Our first paper is titled Trade Agreements and Industry Policy, Can They Work Better Together to Resolve Supply Chain Security and Promote Economic Growth in Asia? It will be presented by Professor Jenny Gordon, Honorary Professor at the Center for Social Research and Methods at the Australian National University and Non-Resident Fellow at the Lowy Institute. The discussant for this paper is Dr. Arif Yamarandi, Senior Research Economist at ADBI. After the presentation and discussant remarks, we will have a short Q&A. Our second paper is The Genius Act, Stablecoins and Asia, presented by Professor Barry Eakin Green, George C. Barday and Helen Ann Barday, Chair and Distinguished Professor of Economics and Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley. The discussant will be my colleague, Dr. Rachita Gulati, Research Economist at ADBI. We will again follow Q&A after the discussant's comments. Each presenter have 30 minutes and 15 minutes each for the discussant. I kindly request presenters and discussants to keep time to the allotted time so that we have sufficient time for the discussion. To the audience, please feel free to submit your questions in Q&A box at any time. With that, let us begin. And Professor Gordon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can see my slides and that I will be able to change them, but please let me know if it's not coming through. It was a real pleasure to be asked.
Professor, we cannot see your slide. Can you share once again?
Okay, I think you guys needed to do something. I'm not quite sure what. Stop showing the main slide. I
think you can share slides now, Jenny, if...
Is that working?
Not yet coming up.
Okay, it means I can't get onto... See if I can go to share again.
Alternatively, we can share your slides from our sides and then... Oh, no.
Oh, we can. We can see.
Come up now.
Okay, so it's now working. Good. But it's not on full screen at the moment, is it?
Yeah.
Okay, let's go to head up and I'll see if I can.
Views.
Yeah, view.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay, as we'll start off on the overview. Thank you. So thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here to talk to you about something that I've been thinking about because of everybody's getting very excited about industry policy again. And industry policy never really went away, but it's come back with a passion and seen by many governments as the solution to everything. And so I thought this was a really good opportunity to think about industry policy in the context of the whole topic of this conference, which was both the middle income trap and then also the issues around regional trade agreements. And can we use regional trade agreements to improve the outcomes and manage the more difficult environment that we're working within, that is, US trade policy and also, the sort of the growth of China. So that was the kind of framing for thinking about this. And also my experiences being involved in the Australian economy and seeing the states compete like mad with each other for certain firms to locate in their state or for certain government support for particular industries in their states. And so it led me to think about cooperation rather than competition as a mechanism which we can actually improve the sets of outcomes. And I think we're living in an environment that is particularly important for that. So my starting point is to sort of argue that we're looking at the US. We've just seen a whole slew of bilateral trade agreements done with Asian economies, and they're aiming actually as much as they can to lock in US technology and influence, and that includes in AI, and to lock out China. And Asia is a primary target for this. Asian countries are being fairly savvy on trying to resist that and give in other areas to kind of try and improve the relationship with the US and get a lower set of tariffs. Um, and China is clearly seeking to build its influence and lock in its technologies, and it has significant power over the supply chains in Asia and also the rest of the world. So what we've got is this great power strategic competition, and what this is really doing is slowing growth, partly just the level of uncertainty, which slows the incentives to invest. But the other thing, and this is more of a long term, but it's accelerating now, is this question about how long an export-led growth model is the best model for development. And what we're seeing is countries turning to industry policies to get an export advantage and also to improve supply chain security and address environmental social objectives. But because they're all trying to do the same thing, you can end up with a lot of beggar thy neighbor type policies. And also, it can end up playing to the market power of the incumbents, which is actually one of the real problems with middle income trap. So I'm going to argue that trade agreements are actually can be a really much more efficient way of achieving many of these industry policy objectives, but we actually need cooperation, and that the Asia sets of agreements that they have, and there's quite a considerable number, offer actually really good platforms for negotiating what I've called, for want of a better word, a cooperative distributive industry policy, and that aims to boost productivity growth and reduce exposure to great power competition. So that's where I'm going to go with the things I'm talking about today. If I can change slides, hopefully. Okay, so it's quite useful to start and think about what are you talking about when we're talking about industry policies. And Juzek, Lane and Roderick have got a very nice definition, which is industrial policies are those government policies that explicitly target the transformation of the structure of economic activity in pursuit of some public goal. And that goal is typically to stimulate innovation, productivity, and economic growth. But increasingly, we're seeing it used, and it says could be used to promote climate transition, good jobs, lagging regions, exports, or import substitution. So, what are the objectives of industry policies? Well, they're industrial development to grow and modernize and grow your economy and develop new to the country or new to the world industries. It's about moving up the value chain, adding more value in the country, and particularly to commodity exports. It's about supply chain security, to negate the costs of supply chain disruptions, deliberate or otherwise. It's about your strategic objectives, and it could be for military capability or capacities, or to create a strategic dependence that can act as a deterrent. And I think this is a really key component of one of the strategic objectives when we're thinking about that idea of a distributed cooperative industry policy. Can also be environmental objectives. And in many cases, this is because, it gets too politically difficult to price in externalities such as put a price on carbon, or you just don't have enough because existing industries, you've got to develop new industries, and existing industries have all the investment in place. And so you need a kind of a government boost or an industry policy to get them up over that hump. And it can also be social objectives. So you really want to slow down structural change sometimes, and this is particularly concerning, but you're trying to offset the impacts by enhancing better jobs so that the people who are left behind aren't going to be left behind, and they'll actually benefit from the structural change and be less resistant to that structural change. So they're your objectives that you've got when you have industry policies. And what we've seen is we had a world in where tariffs were the major sort of form of industry policy for a long time. But over the period as the Washington Consensus really grabbed hold and the WTO was formed after the GATT, we saw this really decline in tariffs. And that's a great chart that just shows how much for most countries, the tariffs just came down from relatively high levels down to very low levels, both in Asia, little less so in sub-Saharan Africa, but they weren't that high to start with, but also throughout Latin America and countries more generally. Whereas the G7 has sort of got them down by the late 80s, and they've stayed relatively low until recently. So why did they move away from protection through tariffs, quotas, and input bans? Partly because economists could demonstrate really easily that these were actually really costly policies. And so instead, governments didn't stop doing industry policies. They did alternatives. They moved to particularly targeted subsidies, tax concessions, subsidized credit, and you can go through those list of things that they are actually putting in place. Some of which are really concerning for trade agreements, and some are not. And so in previous sessions today, we heard a lot about the CTPTP and its much tighter requirements compared to RCEP. And so if you start applying the CTPTP requirements, some of these kinds of approaches to industry policies are actually against the rules of the agreement. And so it rules them out. And so that's one of the issues that I was interested in looking at, the extent to which your industry policies are constrained by the trade agreements that you signed up to. And what we've really seen is a real acceleration in the use of industry policies, really kicking off from about 2017. And this is a great paper that is well worth looking at for anybody interested in industry policies. But you can see that state loans are, for high income and middle income countries, the main approach, and there's sort of variations, but low income countries struggle to have. I mean, they still use state loans, but they tend to try and, do local value adding incentives, and trade finance remains high on all the agendas. So when we look at that, we also sort of see that countries are restricting trade in services as well as goods. And we look down on that right-hand side of the chart, you can see a lot of the countries in that kind of highly restrictive trade services are in ASEAN. And so it's kind of, if you're kind of talking about ASEAN trying to form a common market in goods, they're going to have to think long and hard about the common market in services as well. And particularly as we're moving to more digital service delivery, these are going to become bigger concerns and bigger restrictions on what you're doing. And we'll be looking to trade agreements to relax many of these kinds of policies that are being put in place. So where's the major focus of industry policies? It's on both old and new industries. With the old industries, it tends to be to kind of resist or slow down structural decline. And these are an increasingly costly strategy to deliver relatively few jobs. And it is one of the concerns and reasons for the middle income trap is, kind of protecting the existing old industries and not letting transformation happen is a very successful encouraging FDI, foreign direct investment, in order to be able to export back to the home market of the companies or into the West. And it really depends on the source of advantage for the country and the attractiveness to FDI and how much surplus labour you've got, that how successful that sort of bringing new industries, but new old industries that are new to the country, rather than trying to develop the new industry styles. And then if we look at the infant industry argument, we see import replacement. And the history on that is that very rarely has that been very successful as a platform for those infant industries to grow up and become highly competitive. So as a model of industry policy, nobody's arguing to go there. And we're seeing a lot more cases now made for industry policy in new industries. And this is where China has really excelled. And so now everybody wanting to move into these new industries faces a very high competitor that's out there that has already moved along its sort of volume advantage. It's scaled up, it's dealt with the new industry problems, it's got the agglomeration effects. But to do that starting from scratch needs focused effort, and you need an ability to scale in a competitive environment. And when you've got China as a very large producer, that's a very competitive environment. And so working out how to scale up in these new industries is going to take considerable, I think, cooperation in industry policy to even be able to get out to the point at which you can compete. And what we're seeing now is this idea of supply chain onshoring, and to onshore vulnerable parts of your supply chain or to nearshore them. But one of the problems is you need to actually onshore all parts if you're really onshoring and getting over the vulnerability in your supply chains. And so a lot of the logic behind industry policy is half thought through. And so it's not actually thinking about, you know, the stuff that's sort of focusing on FDI to export to home markets has to really start to think about whether that's going to be a sustainable approach. And I just want to put this slide up because I think it just brings home that almost all policy is trade policy. And really what matters in your industry policy is actually the extent to which you're giving advantage to your domestically located firms. And that when we look at all those instruments in the first column on the left, most of those, or quite a few of them, don't sort of borderline run foul of actually whether they're eligible under their various agreements. And so the things that WTO really constrain are your tariffs above bound rates. There's been a real concerted effort over decades to move away from volume subsidies, particularly for agricultural production, so that you don't get the butter mountains and sort of corn, maize piles, and in Australia the wool piles that we've had in the past, but also trying to constrain export subsidies as an inappropriate way of supporting your industry development. And so what we're seeing instead is things that skirt the compliance, anti-dumping actions that are really more about protecting domestic incumbents, and in some cases with China and Australia using anti-dumping on wine and barley was much more about a weaponization of the anti-dumping regime. It's subsidies to domestic producers on national security, health and environmental grounds, export finance and other allowable supports, using technical grounds for market access rules and security grounds for investment rules. And these are things that are actually constraining what you can actually do, but they sort of skirt within the agreements of the various trade agreements and WTO requirements. So what we've seen is Trump come along and blow the whole system up with the tariffs. There was a discussion earlier today about the CGE modelling when this is and how accurate it is. But I think it's a useful indicator, of, at least, of the potential costs of the kinds of policies that unilateral tariff policies without retaliation in Figure 6 that are going to cost the rest of the world, and the fact that they cost the US the most, even though it's a very large economy. It really can't transfer the costs of its trade policies onto other countries to the extent that had been argued by some of the proponents of the tariff regime. So we've seen this sort of blow up. So it gives us an opportunity to think about doing industry policy differently. And China's industry policy model that's led to overproduction also forces us to think about industry policy differently. And I think one of the really important points, and there was a comment made earlier that, the Asian region could still think about, an export-led growth model rather than growing its own domestic demand. But ultimately, they're going to have to grow their domestic demand because you're going to have to find ways to scale up, and you've got an awful lot of production out there also looking for markets. And if Asian countries want to grow their economies, they're going to need to find markets. So they're going to have to provide markets as well as just relying on selling into third markets. You sort of run out of demand at some point. And there are other reasons for slowing demand that I won't go into, to do a lot with demographics and other issues. So the point that I'm really making is that Asian countries are particularly exposed to both China and the US's behavior. And so given this, uh, this is sort of really pointing to the need to think about a different way of using the trade agreements that we've got, rather than focusing on freeing up trade.
Mm. Professor Gordon, Arif, can you hear
I
Professor
can
Gordon's
hear you.
presentation?
I can hear you, but I think we lost Jenny's connection.
Mm. Okay, so let us wait for some time. I hope she'll be able to join us back soon. Yayoi, can you call Professor Jenny Gordon and
Yes. Okay, I'm calling Professor Jenny Gordon right now.
thank you.
So Professor Jenny Gordon has some internet connection problem, and she's trying to fix it right now. Please be patient and give her a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Yayoi. Okay, Professor is back.
I'm back.
Maybe
I'm
we should
sorry.
stop sharing this screen. Yayoi.
Yes, maybe if you could share, if you could do the sharing, I can. Is that working
Oh,
through now, or
yes, yes.
okay? Or maybe I'll try and keep going with this then, if I can. So I think where I was up to is just to sort of say that Asia has an
Yes,
awful lot of trade agreements.
yes. Tell us
So,
which slide would you like to show, Jenny?
hold on a second, let me get back.
Um,
So I was up to the export-led growth model.
okay.
Slide 14.
So slide 14, please. What? Yeah, that one.
That one, thank you very much. Yeah, for some reason I've got this. Okay, that seems to be working. So I was just sort of making that point again, that you need the middle income countries to actually grow their domestic market so that they are a market for another country. Now doesn't mean that you couldn't have specialization. So what you need is you specialize in areas of comparative advantage so that you can grow the scale to become more productive. Um, and but if everybody tries to do it in the same place, then nobody can get the scale to really grow up in the level of productivity, because scale and productivity are intricately related. But you then get specialization, and that creates vulnerability. So you have to have reliable trading partners. And so what we had done before under the Washington Consensus was say, the markets will sort this out, right? Leave it to firms and companies in the private sector to do it. Um, and the multinational corporations came in and really took advantage of that. But actually, they they also were quite good at playing off countries against each other, and so countries were getting less out of those investments. So their industry policies were of giving tax concessions or tax-free zones or building infrastructure or the like, were delivering fewer returns for the country than you would actually want. And so you're actually seeing, as they started, our countries got stronger, and we had things such as the OECD movement for a global minimum tax, that the multinational corporations got less interested and were looking for alternatives. So go to the next slide. So what we're really looking here is that you've seen a really flattening out of Asia's share in global trade in the chart, but also in GDP. And so what we really want to see is thinking about that industry policy and how we can use it to actually do better without go and escape the middle income trap. And so you need markets to grow to absorb rising production levels, and you need to stop protecting incumbent firms, because you need to be allowed to allow creative destruction to operate. And then the last 2 points there are just really saying that these are sort of additional challenges as a middle income country, that some of your advantages start becoming less dominant, because your population demand a cleaner environment that's a bit more expensive. And as you get rising inequality, you actually get slower market growth, and that can raise the political power of the incumbent firms and make it harder for countries and for governments to actually sort of target industry policy to actually really kickstart again in a way that gets that creative destruction going. And so we can't quite rely on market forces anymore to do it. And we need really clever government, or government to have a way of driving through the incumbents who are looking for policies that suit them, and not necessarily policies that will help introduce and grow new industries in their country, which is what you really need to get out of that middle income trap. So what I'm offering, and we can go to I think I'll skip the next one, which is just when industry policy works. I think that people who are interested can look at that. So sorry, slide 16. People can have read. And so let's move to slide 17, which is, can countries harness the trade agreements to improve the effectiveness of their industry's policies? So I'm going to argue that the answer is yes, and that you can really use trade agreements and specialization to actually get this to happen. And so if we go to the next one of the problems for Asia is that it has a lot of trade agreements, but they're less effective than they actually should be. And one of the reasons for that is that an awful lot of them are bilateral in nature. And there's been comments made in earlier sessions today that the rules of origin are a particular sticking point, and that they can be very hard to satisfy, and hence people don't use the agreements that are there. There's also lots of overlap, and the noodle bowl expression of Asia's trade agreements has received quite a bit of comment, and so I won't repeat that. But it's one of the challenges is that you've got a whole bunch of trade agreements and they're not working as well as they should. And there's an awful lot of overlap, particularly in the intra-Asia sets of agreements. So if we go to this next slide, you can just see that that ratio of bilateral trade agreements in intra-Asia, and that it's really the regional agreements, a bilateral, a regional agreement or plurilateral, that really are the ones that are able to deliver benefits. But just to comment on the European, who have quite a lot in that area and far fewer bilateral agreements, is that one of the things that they are struggling to do, because it's challenging, is actually see how you can get um, companies or countries to cooperate in a way that says, we will specialize in this and you will specialize in that and you will specialize in something else, and we'll all trade with each other. You get a lot of everybody going, oh, this is the greatest thing, we all want to do the same thing, and so you don't get the coordination. And for Europe, that is really clear when it comes to defense technologies and all of them doing their own thing. And so it's a similar kind of idea that you need to get this more coordination going on. So if we go to slide 20, this is a nice study that has been done recently, looking at the trade effects of industrial policies. And one of the really interesting ones is that the benefits of uh, preferential trade agreements is very negative on non-members, but deep agreements can deliver considerable benefits to the members of those agreements. But what you don't want in a regional agreement is you really want to be able to grow that member deep PTA side of benefits and not impose the big negative costs on the non-members, because or you just widen it so that there's very few non-members out there. And so I think this is where we need to be seeing ourselves, or seeing the sort of cooperation in Asia to move to. So we just move to the next slide. So what I'm arguing for is really this case for coordinating your industry policies, and that actually is very important, can actually also deliver supply chain security, as well as helping countries to get onto a new growth path. And the logic behind this is onshoring your supply chain is only possible for big, diverse economies. And really, the US is the only one with the complete capability of doing that. Everyone else is reliant on imports for some critical inputs, whether it's food and fuel. All countries trying to do everything is an absolute recipe for failure, and they will lack the scale to compete with China. And so if you can cooperate on which country does what in a supply chain, you can improve the scale, hence the productivity, and hence be competitive with China on that. And this is how you create the ability to diversify within, away from just so you want a China plus plus type of policy. And parties to the regional agreement would need to commit to complementarity rather than better than our neighbour industry policies. And one of the ways to do it is to get countries to rank their industry policy targets and to negotiate a cooperative approach, so that where you've got targets that are competing with each other, there's sufficient market scale in their home market, and or the external market scale sufficient to accommodate all the members' intended production level or target production levels, that all elements in the supply chain are available to all members from at least one member with guarantees of access, and that you really need coordination on standards, certification processes, and all the other elements that facilitate trade to actually allow this to happen. Because if you don't do that third dot point, it's very difficult to actually be able to coordinate in a way where you really get this complementary production model going. Next slide. And this is really just to sort of say this is sort of the massive interconnectedness. So really what I'm arguing is we need more interconnectedness, but we need interconnectedness that doesn't always rely on China and the US as being a central point in that connectedness, and that regional agreements are a good way to target that independence with choice. And I think that it's people, countries are capable of doing this cooperation, Um, and they need to, because we're just facing such a difficult external environment now, and it's now really up to countries to work together to overcome this. So if we go to the last slide, I think it's the last one. So this is my pitch for a cooperative distributive industry policy. And this differs from just deepening bilateral and regional PTAs. It's about being strategic, and it aims to provide additional sources of supply along the value chain to reduce supply chain vulnerability. It's about playing as far as you can to comparative advantage, and comparative advantage that gets built from agglomeration economies and scale to make your industry policy an important part of developing new industries as well as remaking old ones, particularly greening old industries. It's about negotiation. Countries need to coordinate the industry policies to avoid eating each other's lunches, but they need to share expertise and support industry development in partner countries to improve complementarities. And your industry policies need to be firm agnostic. It's about coordinating on industries and parts of the supply chain and then letting the firms compete for what the subsidies or the approaches you're taking, tax concessions and the like under industry policy. And then if we go to the last slide, it just really points out the overlapping. So if you go to 24, it really points out the overlapping trade agreements we have here. It was quite fun trying to work out how everything fitted together. I think I've got it right, but countries, new countries are bidding to get into the CPTPP and others. And so you can sort of see that ASEAN sits at the core of so many of these trade agreements. So really ASEAN will be key. And in some ways, the FIT-P sort of new agreement that Singapore has been championing does follow somewhat the kind of suggestions that I'm making about a platform for more coordination. So I think the last one is just questions, and so I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Sorry about losing you in the middle of it.
Thank you, Professor Jenny Gordon, for very extensive and very wonderful presentation. This paper will be discussed by Arif. The floor is to you, Arif.
Thank you. Thank you, Ngawang, and thank you, Jenny, for a wonderful presentation. Let me apologize before I start my comment for the lack of structure, perhaps, in trying to comment to your paper. But I really enjoyed reading the slides that you have shared with us, as well as listening to your comprehensive discussion or explanation about the ideas in the paper. Jenny's presentation is about trade agreements and industrial policy, asking a question whether they can work better together to resolve supply chain security and promote economic growth in Asia. It is a very interesting and timely topic, and I really like the answer that Jenny provided in the presentation. So basically, Jenny, the paper argues that trade agreement and industry policy would work better together. And part of the reason that supported that is because the paper argues that the trade agreement will provide a more efficient way for countries to operate, while industrial policy would actually help domestic producers to be able to compete with its competitor. So one takeaway that I'd like to bring out of the presentation was that the fact that industrial policy should be done in such a way that does not really going against competition or competition. Not going against competition, but going into supporting industries to be able to achieve some economies of scales that are comparable to the competitors, be it inside the country or outside the country, to participate better in the market. At the end of the day, if this thing could be realized, then it is going to be consumer and the economy economic welfare in general that would positively benefit out of the situation. So that's the main takeaway that I'd like to take out. Let me just get a bit more specific on few stuffs. One thing that is observed in the paper is the fact that tariff policies or the rate of tariffs has been reduced quite consistently up to the mid of 20 up to around 2015. So, but then again, Jenny has also rightly mentioned that recent unilateral tariff policies from the US have somewhat reversed it. In that note, I think there is a risk that international trade might be, or the size of the international market might be reduced in a way. So policies on trade on freer trade or agreements that promote freer trade might help on somewhat reducing this burden. And as we've heard from previous sessions, there are a lot of support for more multilateralism as well as promoting policies or economic cooperation or integration that are open in terms of regionalism. So it should not be a closed regionalism, but should be directed into an open one. Now, let me get into the industrial policy part a bit, because at the end of the day, when you have markets that are competitive, then basically your domestic producers should be able to compete with it. For developing countries in general, one of the often found issues is the fact that the level of competitiveness of domestic producers is not or cannot yet match the level of competitiveness of more advanced market or more advanced economies. And hence the production costs of the industries cannot compete with the production cost of others. And if that situation remains, then basically an open trade policy would imply pressures for domestic industry to keep on producing. In this sense, Jenny has rightly mentioned that a lot of industrial policy will have to do to restricting. Has had to do with restricting trades. This is something that, in my opinion, and I think I also get that from Jenny's presentation, needs to be avoided. What needs to be done here is basically avoid policies or industrial policies that would limit competitions, such as import restrictions and so on and so forth, because those kind of policies will be restraining the domestic producers from being competitive and hence resulting in domestic producers that will never be able to participate in the global market. With that situation, then basically either country will have to rely more and more into imports or basically remain small in terms of size and hence will have difficulties to graduate from middle income if the country has already been in a middle income category. So this kind of policies that limit competition will eventually lead a country into lowering or limiting aggregate welfare of its own economy and hence have to be avoided. What would then be a kind of industrial policy that could be productive? Jenny has given a lot of examples, but I like charts that she presented in her slide number 6, particularly on low-income economies. The type of industrial policy that incentivize local value addition is considered as one that is most often being adopted. This is good if promoting or incentivizing local value addition is not done through limiting import competition, but is done through improving domestic technological capacity and production efficiency in order to improve their economies of scale, in the sense not just trying to get into the bottom of their average cost curve, but also to shift their average cost curve downwards. In this note, I'd like to say that industrial policy objective of any developing countries needs to get into its necessary condition first. What is the necessary condition that I'm talking about here? It is to ensure the competitiveness of domestic industries. For the country to have competitive domestic industries, then basically its industrial policy would have to go against limiting competitions to begin with. That's the basic condition of nurturing competitiveness of your local industry. So avoid doing import restrictions or import substitution kind of policy, which may not be working very well, but try to focus more on trying to incentivize innovations and capacity upgrading of your local economy. On that note, then basically, once that is already in place, then basically a country or the policy can move into its sufficient condition by providing supportive domestic regulatory environment for the industry to grow further and utilizing regional cooperation and integration to facilitate trade. Jenny has already mentioned that in order to do so, policies to promote domestic industries has to rely on comparative advantage arguments. By doing this is perhaps one of the easiest way, if not the only way, for the policy to actually being able to promote the improvement of the industrial productivity. Last but not least, RCI could also be utilized in order to facilitate technology transfer. But in practice, we know exactly the technology transfer has never been taking place voluntarily. So one of the things that could also be included in a lot of different economic cooperation or integration agreement is to look at how to promote FDI flows, because the FDI flows would be one of the channels through which industrial or indirect technological transfer could take place. The reason I call this as indirect technological transfer is simply because of the fact that the technological transfer has to be done or has to be done creatively by the FDI receiving countries. The FDI, the countries that promoting, the countries that are investing will have no incentive to promote technological transfer because basically the investment itself should be more profit based on profit motives. So in order to have the technological transfer to take place, the receiving countries are the one that needs to have to design the right strategy for that technology to be adopted and transferred into domestic production capacity. I think I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ari, for providing a very comprehensive discussion on the presentation of Professor Johnny Gordon. I think most of the discussions are general comments, so I don't think there's need for Professor Johnny Gordon to respond to this comment. If there's any questions, then first I would like to provide this opportunity to panelists. Please do raise your hand if you like to ask some questions. Okay, so maybe they are preparing a question. So in the meantime, let me take this opportunity to ask one very basic question. I'm asking this question from the assuming that some policymakers may have this kind of questions in their mind. So one of the slide, in one of your slide, you specifically mentioned that Asia has lots of trade agreements, but they are less effective. If you could elaborate on this, how we can make it more effective, is more is having a less, does it mean that having a less trade agreement is better than having a more trade agreement? Could you elaborate on this?
Happy to do so, but first, thank you to Ari for really clarifying and adding to the sort of points I was trying to make in my paper. So what you've one way to think about the Asian agreements is if you really cooperated as a region. So let's say you're all states in a united Asia, right? You would still, like the European unions do, have national interests and things like that involved, but you'd have a lot more common interest in, well, you do this well, and you do this well, and you do that well. As structured, the agreements that you've got don't encourage that kind of common interest. It's a bit like, well, I want to do this, and everything when you negotiate an agreement is, I've got a list of things I want, and I don't want to give you anything. So that's often what you get, right? And that's the trade negotiators' kind of way of going about doing things. And so you win when you get a lot of things on your list and don't give anybody else much of things on their list. This is actually fundamentally thinking about doing things differently to say, actually, there's a whole bunch of common interests in terms of standards and the like. And you do have to compromise. You do have to give up the way you might have done something and do it the way somebody else was doing it. But if you both do it the same way, then you have actually increased the chance that your producers can enter that market and their producers can enter your market. So you actually also increase competition when you agree on standards and the like. So that's sort of a baseline starting point that allows you to cooperate better within these agreements. Now, to a certain degree, the CTPTP is sort of set up to do more of that and to negotiate with that. RCEP is not really set up to do that. And ASEAN has done less of that than we might have hoped that they would actually do. Um, so that's kind of one of those things. But what I'm saying is that there's the opportunity to go a step further because there is a big competitor out there called China. And in almost everything you do, there is a big competitor. So if you can sort of say, I'm not thinking about having to be really efficient and competitive in my own domestic market because my own domestic market is too small for me to get the scale and to be able to build the kind of agglomeration economies of scale that are there. And even to then use and attract a multinational corporation who can be there as a kind of a catalyst for an aggregator around them. Um, yes, you've got to be able to supply that multinational corporation with talent and the other sort of supporting things that you want in the country. But if you then say, well, within the region, it's a big enough market. And so rather than me do it in my nation, we'll do it within the region. And then, you're sort of saying which firms within that region can do that really well. So this is where you get the cooperation. And so you're trying to create one hub where we're really looking at everything's going high tech these days, right? And the agglomeration economies matter so much more. You don't just need a big bit of empty land and electricity supply and transport links anymore. You actually need talent and pools of talent and the like to be able to come together. So what we're really saying is you've got a big competitor out there. We want to be able to compete with that big competitor. They got to where they got through a lot of industry policy and a lot of support. So we may actually have to say, let's work together as a region to do that. But we recognize we all can't do it. And the more we compete between each other, the less likely we're able to achieve that because we'll just spread the effort. Nobody will ever get to scale. We'll be trying to steal, FDI and give them good deals, give the multinational corporations the best deal and they'll say, oh, I want a better deal and the like. Hold on a second. I've just got somebody hubby just came home. Um, so, uh, so that's kind of what we're saying, is just can we think about using those and creating a deep regional agreement that is able to do that? And then what you've got is a platform where other countries will go, we'd like to be involved in that too. And that's great because they'll bring market scale to the table. They'll bring their expertise to the table, and that they'll be able to say, well, these are the areas we think we could specialize in and fit. So what we're really saying is, in this world where we got a lot of integration, and then the integration got weaponized, can we work within the regional agreements to get integration that is so integrated that it can't be weaponized because we're all dependent on each other? Um, and so it's almost sort of saying what we wanted to do at a global level, and then you got China super successful, very large population, very big scale, the US very, very big, and didn't do their own domestic policies well to actually support structural change in their economy, and as a result have a whole bunch of people who missed out of the benefits of trade and the whole technology development, and that changed the politics of the place. Can we do something that is sort of saying, "Well, let's try and do that within, but we're going to have to make it happen because we're going to have to coordinate because the market as such won't do it for us. So we need governments to get together. It won't be across all things. It'll just be in some areas, and then you let competition and normal stuff rip in the background of everything else. But in some areas, particularly for supply chain security, particularly in areas where we have critical vulnerabilities, can we work together to actually resolve those problems and then be a viable competitor against the US and against China because we've got together and we've got the scale that we actually can do this now?" That's kind of the basis of the ideas.
Thank you very much, Professor Gordon, for very comprehensive explanation, and I cannot agree more than that. All the points are well noted. With this, I think still we don't have any questions, so let us move to. Oh, we have one question from panelist Arif.
Yeah, just want to add a bit when you're drafting the paper later, Jenny. Perhaps you can also touch a bit more on the cooperation or in cross-country agreements across investment. Yeah, FDI investment. That's something that I didn't really find comprehensively discussed in your presentation. Thanks.
Okay. Thank
Yes,
you very
certainly.
much.
I agree. Yeah, it's an
Thank
important
you.
area.
Thank you, Professor Jenny. We are looking forward to reading your final work.